Let's get it started, man. This is going to be a great chat. I'm excited to have
Do
Mr.
it.
Seattle
Benjamin.
data guy with us in the house. He is, as we were just saying, a prolific writer. He's got all kinds of good stuff on Medium. So if you are not following him on Medium, check it out right now or once we finish with this podcast, whenever you get to
Now,
the
right now.
conclusion.
Everyone stop what you're doing. Go
Pull your
right
car
now.
over if you are driving and
You got to
look
read
him
right
up.
now.
And so, yeah, Benjamin, it is a pleasure to have you here with us. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the learnings that you've found around MLOps and data science, data engineering. I mean, you are a man of many hats, I could say.
Yeah, no, thank you both. Thank you, Demetrius and David, for inviting me. Technically, David, you said my name how my parents had me technically be correct. Yeah, Benjamin, since I'm from Romania, so it's like, yeah, it's actually right.
Nice.
So yeah, thank you guys.
Well, how about we start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself. What are you working on? What are you doing right now at the moment? Just tell us anything you want. What's up with you?
Sure. So, I mean, like right now at the moment, so again, like doing plenty of consulting, plenty of writing. I'm helping one company develop some more of a like categorization model for themselves. They do a lot of legal documentation work where basically they provide other companies with kind of condensed bits of information about what's going on as far as, laws and regulations. And so that, it can be very hard to kind of track all that information and what's going on. So they've kind of helped condense it down and clean it up. And now they're just trying to improve kind of how they categorize it. So that way they can, when person A and person B are interested in some topic, they can better, provide them that information rather than them having to even sift through their site. Another company I'm working with is looking to kind of improve kind of how people rent buses, because I guess a lot of that is either done online through some brokers or a little more like through kind of like the actual owner's websites. So they're trying to create something that's a little more friendly for everyone, and has everyone win. And part of that also involves kind of like a pricing model. So like, something that's very similar to like Lyft or Uber. So those are some of the current big projects that I'm working on right now. Yeah. And then like plenty of writing. I think I have this current goal for writing where I'm doing from raw to machine learning. That's kind of like the topic. We're from raw data to machine learning. So
nice.
Basically, I've just been trying to write from like ETLs, data warehouses, ELTs, all the way to deploying a model, either MLOps or on a Lambda function, or from scratch, like just like manually, like and talk through those different kind of processes, and so like and really going through each of those kind of steps in between. Just so someone can think about that whole entire data lifecycle and data pipeline.
Yeah, that's one thing that I definitely noticed in your writing is how you looked at the whole spectrum. And it makes sense now that you're saying that, from raw to production. And so what are some of these learnings, key things that jump out at you? I know you've written a lot on many different topics and you've dove into the specifics, but what are some things that maybe are top of mind for you as you are doing this project?
Sure. I think one of the interesting things that I always remember is like back the first time I ever like tried to do something even relatively close to a data science project. You get to this point where you're like, okay, I've written this thing in R, and now what? Like it does the thing that I want it to do, but now what? And I was like, whatever, 22 at the time. So and like working full time, but like no one really had that next step, set up. And I that's when I kind of realized like it's like, oh, it's like there's a gap here where it's like data scientists think about like, oh, we'll do this research and we'll like analyze this thing, but like, okay, but then like how does it go from here to actually touching people and working with and interacting in systems? And I realized that there's like there's that kind of gap, especially like from like if you're fresh out of school, you don't really talk about that. You kind of learn how to make the thing work, but you don't learn how to deploy it. And there's some similarities with software engineering, but I think software engineering has been around so long that like most companies have the process is clear, right? Like it's like, oh, whether it's DevOps or if it's more manual, it's very like outlined. It's like, here's our deployment process, step 1 through 30. I didn't see that necessarily as much with like data scientists, where it's like, oh, here's a clear deployment process. That was also like 5 years ago. I think we're definitely seeing the proliferation of tools and techniques where people kind of think about that nowadays. So that's something that's been.
It's funny you mentioned that though, because there's something that's interesting that I thought you wrote about, and it was like the importance of having a mentor. And that makes total sense when you're looking at it that way. And like you said, with software engineering, you can kind of, it's already there. It's very much mature, but here it's not so clear. And so when you're a data scientist and you're trying to go to that next step, it is very nice to have someone at your job who has already done it and can show you, okay, here's how we do it. And whether or not it is doing it manually or automating it, just like being able to show you the trail that you need to walk on is super helpful.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think in so many ways, like whether you're a software engineer or data scientist or, whatever kind of technical role you have, I was not fortunate enough in my first company to have a mentor. Like my mentor, literally, it was like he was there, and then 2 weeks later, he's like, "Peace out, I'm leaving." So it was like, and then like they didn't hire a new tech person, and it was just like, "Oh yeah, you're the new guy." And so it was like just learning all this stuff, and I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of terrible code, and then I just remember going to the next company and like looking at their infrastructure, looking at their code, and being like, "Okay, so this is how I should have been doing it." And like realizing how valuable it would have been to have someone that like like kind of is there and like hits you in the head occasionally, like whether it's tough love or gentle, whichever way the person likes to do it, like just someone that's like, this is a bad idea, your code's written poorly, like calls you out, because you don't know all the time. I mean, some people do, some people come out of school, I'm sure, and are great coders, but I think most of us don't. Like we're like, well, we made it work, so that's good.
We learn by making mistakes, right? By failing a bunch of times and making big boo-boos in production, deleting stuff by accident. But yeah, that's how you learn, right? As these, and I think it's a great point that you brought up. Like, like a lot of the stuff that you learn in school is theoretical, it's kind of abstracted away, right? But really, when you're working in a real life system, a production system, it's very complicated, right? There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of particulars to the domain. And then it's just the everyday, just like challenges that come up, and so like no one obviously can prepare you for that. It's just one of those things you have to just learn by getting in, getting your hands dirty, actually getting in the code, writing it, fixing things, breaking things. Like that's just how you learn this stuff. I mean, I wish it was like there was like a book that like taught you everything. This is what you need to know to be an effective engineer. But there's really not much like that. I find it all spread out through a lot of different, even disciplines, right? Like there's a lot of influence, not even from just engineering that helps me, but even, other random, sort of disciplines. But yeah.
And that's along that point. I think it's interesting to think about this article that you wrote about like Agile and data science and what the benefits and what potentially the cons are for like trying to work Agile and in being a data scientist. Can we jump into that? Because I think there's so many like nuggets of wisdom there. And first of all, like maybe can you give us a little background on that blog post and how it came up, why you wanted to write it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was definitely kind of covering a concept that I'd heard a few times, like people talking about it. And I think in the tech field, we have this tendency to amalgamate everything. Like it's like, oh, this is all tech, so it should all work the same, right? Like because Agile, it works in coding, it should work in data science the same way. I think there's this tendency to just kind of like MLOps even, right? Like I agree with the MLOps concept, but like, we do have that tendency to just be like, well, we have DevOps, so this is now MLOps. And sometimes I think we do that too quickly, where it's like, does it really make sense? Just to go back with MLOps, I do kind of see it as it making sense, just because to me, I believe the ops part is like, once we have a discipline that's kind of maturing and we start like having more concrete processes, once you start automating that process, that's where I kind of think like that's where it kind of fits that ops thing. But as far as Agile, yeah, no, I mean, I that's kind of what brought it about. It was like, thinking about like, it seems like a lot of people are talking about this. Well, okay, does it fit? Sort of. Yeah, sure. There are aspects of it that you can bring in to data science, but I think, just sticking it on top of your data science workflow doesn't necessarily always work, right? Data science is very or software is very results driven, where it's like very easy to be like, hey, build this piece of code, and it should do X. It should be X plus X equals Y. That should be the output, right? The input and the output should be very clear. And I think sometimes data science isn't that way, right? Like when you look at like more like kind of true data science, where it's like it's more research based and like kind of long term project, where there's like likelihood of failure. It's like you might not even bring like think about how much science doesn't bring anything on the other side, right? Like it's like no.
Yeah, and that's so funny you say that, because somebody in the Slack community was talking about that. Like they were asking, how can I talk to my boss who's like angry at me because everything that I've been doing hasn't, like, there's been nothing that's come from it yet. And he's like, how can I tell him that this is just research and you shouldn't be expecting everything that I do to come out with some, groundbreaking model?
Yeah, no, I think like you kind of have to, maybe depending on what kind of research you're doing, hopefully, I think your eventual hope is that you come up with that, $10 million savings, right? Like that's your saving grace. It's like, I think if I recall, even like Google or Facebook, like I don't remember what it was. I think I remember reading an article about Google, or I'm trying to remember where they were basically like, oh, you're expected to do something or create some sort of like decent amount of either algorithm work or something, or come up with some sort of research that saves the company X amount of money, like every like 1 to 2 years or something, where it's like, then it makes sense. I'm trying to remember where I ended up reading that, but it's like, it made a lot of sense. Where it's like, yeah, it's
interesting.
Like, it's like, yeah, like you might not always come up with something. And I think it's kind of silly to push for it.
But over the long term.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point, because there's a lot of failed experiments are not necessarily failures from a business perspective, right? You've learned something about the value of this data set, or maybe it's not valuable. You've eliminated some possibilities. You maybe try to frame it in a certain way and it's just not really helpful. Like sometimes you could build a model, right, for some problem, but maybe clustering or something really simple, or some sort of heuristic is a little bit, more is just as performant, and it maybe saves you a lot of trouble making, this super complicated thing work. So yeah, I think that I've dealt with that myself, where it's not a research is it's like more open-ended than an engineering deliverable, right? And it's very difficult to say when something is like done or it's ready, and it's like, yeah, you could always like make it a little bit better or do another analysis to realize something that, maybe you missed, or I feel like it's very difficult to know when something is done versus like a system that you built, it's up and running, it's available, I can make requests to it. It's like, that's like, okay, it works. Versus an ML model, when it's out in production, you're like, sometimes you have to wait, right? You may have to wait a little while just to know if it actually is making predictions that make sense. And that, I think that, like you said, those are the differences that aren't as clean cut, and maybe an agile process doesn't really account for as well. But it doesn't mean it's pointless. I think that I've heard some people say it's like it doesn't work. I don't know if I agree with that, because I do think it does have some value just to organize work. It's like a useful way to learn how to work.
Yeah. No, I think it's the way I kind of use it. It's like you can still break down work. Like I think you call that one point where it's like just analyzing the data to see if it's worthwhile. Like that can be a bit of work that's like, yeah, like that could take like a week. Like I can see that taking, and like you should take a week. Like I think like some people are like, oh, we'll do it in like a day. It's like, should you take a day to like look at that data? Like take some time, like think about it, because taking that week now maybe saves you 6 weeks of model development that you realize is trash later on, right?
Such a good point.
I can, again, younger version of me would like just someone give you data and it's like, okay, this data must be good, and like you just start building a model, and like later on you'd be like, this data's garbage. Like I just spent 4 weeks like building something that like is based on stuff that's either manually input, so it's not great, or something like that. So spending that time on that first part, I think is valuable. So yeah, I think there's value in kind of just breaking it up, like breaking up work, because again, it just helps you approach things and know when things are done. I like to say like when boxes are opened and closed. That way when you open some boxes and then close them and put them away and you're done. And it also helps just like providing communication, right? Like it's like, oh, where are you on this project? Like which part is delaying it? And I think it just lets you kind of say like, oh, it's I'm stuck on, exploratory data analysis. I don't think that's where you'd be stuck, but like, some clear step in the process, so that someone can kind of get like, okay, that makes sense. Now I know.
Yeah, and that's something that you also wrote about that I thought was super important and I wanted to bring up was the idea of defining your data science process and the need for that and how different it is, like you were talking about, between like software engineering and data science, because it's not so clear cut. You can't just say like, okay, I'm going to do this and then expect for that to be done in 2 weeks, because maybe you do this, but then you have to go back around and go back to the drawing board, right? So maybe we can dive into that a little bit more and hear your thoughts on the idea of defining the data science process and what you've seen that works when you have to define it.
Yeah, no, and I think David kind of brought this up earlier, where it's like, you're kind of never done, arguably, with research, right? Like that's one of the things I think with like analysis or research is like you can always go down another rabbit hole. So like as far as like defining a data science process, that's kind of like one of the reasons I like wrote about that concept. It's like if you don't have something that's kind of, at least, again, whether it's like 100% clear cut or it's just guidelines, I'm more of like a guidelines kind of person. It's like you don't have to like follow exactly, but just have a general process. It just lets you know when things are done. It's like, okay, we've looked at this data, we've kind of done some general analysis, we've gained some interesting insights. It might not be anything necessarily worthwhile, but it might be interesting and worth writing about. So we wrote like a quick one pager, like a quick conclusion, save your queries, save your whatever kind of code, and kind of bundle it all up. And now you kind of have a deliverable. So at least you have something you can feel like it's done. And so you've gone through that whole process. And again, like it lets you communicate very easily to your manager, like, hey, where are you in this process? And you can say, yeah, we're looking at the data. We're kind of currently kind of writing up some graphs and charts. I'm writing up a report, and we'll present it or something. We'll talk through it. Just something, again, to kind of like make sure your manager and anyone who's like interested in the project has some sort of something at the end that's tangible. So I think, again, with data scientists, we don't always have something that's very tangible, and I think there's value, I think, in just having something that's like, okay, this is the work that I did, both for your own betterment and also your like mental health. Otherwise, like, what did I do for the last 2 weeks? I was just like running experiments in R, and
that counts as work. And I think that's one of the challenges, like for doing research, is that like, especially when you think about like your career, you're talking about what you've done, what you've accomplished at your role in your current role. It's like, yeah, I've done a lot of data science, but what the hell does that even mean? Like, all right, well, did a bunch of experiments, had to write some code to build this, to see if it works. But yeah, like, really trying to think through what exactly you did is not always so clear cut. One thing that I saw that I thought was really cool, we haven't used it ourselves, is I don't know if you heard of it, the Microsoft data science process. So it's like this, basically the guidelines around writing up the things that you did. So let's say you had to use this piece of infrastructure, reach out, you get data from this data set. You would just document like literally that process. Like I did this, I used this data set, it had this many columns, these features. And when I shared it with some of the data scientists, it seemed a little bit like, verbose, like you have to do all this writing, but I actually think it's really useful for your own, understanding of what you actually did, and to be able to share that and communicate the value of what you did, even if it was, like you said, something that was a failure, like the model actually isn't performant, but we know, hey, a baseline is actually better than, a fancy model. That sometimes I think can be communicated writing about it, right? Versus just, assuming that, if you didn't productionize it, it's not valuable, which is, I feel a lot of the times that what people feel like, if it's not on production, if it's not a software product, it's not really doing anything. But there's a lot of value in the messes, in the failures, that I think that writing about it or finding some way to reproduce the results in some way could be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's another benefit of that, like writing it down and having it. I can imagine that people gave you pushback on it because they're probably like, dude, so much extra work. Like, I don't have enough work already. But it gives you a little bit more job security, we could say, because how many times have I heard people say, oh, the higher ups have no idea what the data scientists are doing, and they just think that they're paying them a bunch of money to sit around and twiddle their thumbs. And so this will help them understand what is happening, even if they're not getting models into production.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think it's about, again, it's about creating that layer of communication. I mean, that's where I ended up picking up the kind of idea of like having a process. Was like I was working with a team, and like the manager was just like, look, this is what I want. Like at the very least, like in your Excel, just like put the question that you're trying to answer, put your conclusion, and then like put your charts below that you're supporting it. And like she basically went to everyone like I just need this just to like, and then we'll save it and we'll have it in the future. And it's just like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Like, yeah, duh. Again, something you don't think about in school, because like no one tells you how to do like data analyst process. Like I remember I would just like when I first started, like I'd write queries and then I'd be like, I'd do some analysis, and then someone would ask for something done again, and I'd be like, shoot, where's that query? Wait, where did I put that? I have that query somewhere.
Totally, yeah.
Like,
and on what
just
data?
Having, yeah, exactly. Or something where it's like someone asks a similar question, and it's like you could have just given them that report, or it's just those things where it's like having that ability to always look back. There's a lot of value there, and I think a lot of people just like are like, oh, I'll just like analyze this data and write up a PowerPoint and then be done with it, and then lose all that information that I did and all the work that I did. So.
See, I bet you probably have to deal with this a lot, right? When you're working with clients, like writing up an invoice, maybe, right? Like, hey, I did, like, you have to account for like the analysis work that you did, and maybe there's not like a finished notebook, but maybe you spent all day writing a bunch of code that actually doesn't get productionized, but it's work, right? So how do you navigate those challenges? Like, what are there any tools in particular, any processes that help you quantify the value of your work to your clients?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, one, it's usually their end result. Like, for example, with the payment optimization, like, right? Like, we're like, oh, look, based on last year versus this year, you've been able to increase your sales or like average sales cost by like whatever 9 or 10%. So it's like, yeah, there's proof right there. I think that's a big one in general. If you put something into production, I guess you also asked if it's not in production. I think I'll generally end up always putting together some sort of like research or just a 1-pager or 2-pager that just says, hey, here's what I did. Here's my conclusions from this, the research that we did. Here's some things you might want to look up later. Like, this was just kind of an initial analysis. If you want to like look up these points later. And I think that's like one point I talk about in the process is like, you'll always have new questions. Write those down, kind of be like, okay, because you're going to forget those questions, later on in the future. So write down those questions based off, what you've got. It's like, hey, based off of, what we figured out here, you could look in more and possibly find value, in these directions. Write those down. So then if that client either wants to do more in the future or whatever, they've got it and they know where to look, or they know where to send someone else to look, whether it's you or, a different client or consultant. I think that's always the thing. It's like you should always make sure if you're hit by a bus, right, like that someone can pick up your work. And I think that's the big thing that I always try, regardless if I'm consulting or working from for a full-time kind of gig. It's like, someone should always be able to pick up your work and be like, okay, this is good.
Nice. So I forgot to mention to you all, and Benjamin, I know you don't know this, but we tend to wear wacky shirts on this show, and I just got a new one from my wife.
Nice.
For Christmas, early Christmas. So I wanted to show it off real fast. Check out my pineapples.
Some pineapples with some glasses. It's like a teal, and it's just great swag. Thanks for that. Anyways, back to what we were saying. So what I was going to ask Benjamin, so one other thing that I want to just kind of talk about more. So you mentioned like being able to show the impact of your work by saying, okay, there was an increase in X or a decrease in Y or whatever. So what tools, so one thing let me step back a second. So we talk about monitoring a lot, right? To be able to observe the performance of a model in production, thinking about concept drift, data drift, but even something like simpler than that. What about, just showing that, or how do you relate it to like the business metrics? So like, let's talk a little bit about how you can show the value of your work, the impact of your work using monitoring and observation tools, observability. There you go. Observability tools. Sorry about that.
Yeah. And I think there's there's definitely a lot of there's a lot of fancy things you can do. There's a lot of not as fancy things you can do. Especially when I work with like smaller companies, which I think has been a majority of my clients. Just even a simple Tableau dashboard where it's like you're tracking the right metrics. I think it's about picking the metrics you think are related. So again, like average sale price. Like okay, that makes sense. Like if you're doing a price optimization tool, you want to see that average sale price go up probably. So that's, or maybe it's like you're trying to turn around maybe like what am I trying to think? The amount that you actually close a deal or something, like right, for a company where if you're doing like a lot of sales. So you want to pick a metric that I think makes sense. And I think you see this even like with large companies, right? Like Facebook, Twitter, whatever social media company, you'll see like engagement, right? Or YouTube, right? Like engagement is their big metric. I think that a lot of these companies focus on. And as they're doing whatever, some small change in the model or some small change in the website, they make that change and then they see if engagement is impacted. And so really, I think a lot of it can be as simple as that, like make sure you pick metrics that can be impacted by these things, and then just track it. Again, you don't necessarily need a crazy observability tool. I know there are a lot of great tools. I know like I think I talked to you guys, or at least Demetrius, about this, like ylabs.ai, I think is doing a lot of stuff as far as observability goes. I also realized how hard that word is to say when I talked to Andy Dang. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't say observability. I've never had to say this out loud.
You have to say it a bunch too. It doesn't help.
It's like, I'm still speaking and I haven't finished the word. So I get that. So there are a lot of tools, and I think especially like you talk about like data drift and just logging and tracking the right metrics, I think are definitely there for more complex models. But I think in general, like once you put a simple model in, it's like just make sure you have metrics that you can either support or believe are like connected to this the model that you're building. So I think that's generally is you need to pick them first. I think that's the one thing that people also talk about is like, don't pick metrics after doing it. Right? I was like, oh, okay, these metrics went up. You kind of have to be like, okay, what are we watching for, and pick those up in the first place, and then watch them versus the other way. Because again, I think sometimes we like doing that, right? Like it's like, oh, we're gonna pick these metrics now that we're done.
Yeah, you see what moved and what actually looks better, and you go, oh, well, it must have been a success. Look at all these metrics that went up.
Yeah, where it's like, but it could have been luck.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was this idea of communication, because I know you've blogged about it quite a bit, and the importance of communication, how communication can enable collaboration with data scientists, and the I think it was a program that you have about a data leader workshop.
Yeah.
And so it's basically like amplifying the abilities for data scientists to clearly communicate. And so how can we do that? How can we be better communicators?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways, right? Like one is just having that ability to be more transparent in your work. And then also just I think one of the things that I heard about a lot of like kind of senior leadership that I would talk to, one of the problems they would have is like they say like, oh, we'd hire these really smart data scientists and they would like write up these reports, but they would never either have a conclusion or they would never like kind of like distill it all down into a very concise, but why is this important kind of thing. And so I think that's one place I saw that like could be improved a lot with some people is like, oh, yeah, like just have kind of a perspective or a point of view or a conclusion at the end of all this research, right? Like you did all this stuff, you gave this your manager all these numbers, but you didn't really say what they meant. And so I think there's kind of that point that's really important. And then I think general also, just from a collaboration standpoint, being able to say what you're doing and being able to kind of say the value, I think is very important. I think sometimes, and I have the same problem. I think sometimes us as like data scientists, data engineers, software engineers, we get very tied up in the how. I think a lot of us get tied up in how something's going to get done, not necessarily the value of it, like the business value of it. And so like trying to step away, not just from, saying like, oh, I'm going to build this model and it's going to give you like 98% accuracy on this, whatever. And it's like, great. But like, how does that impact my business? Again, like kind of going back to like, whether it's that bottom line, that sales, average sales price, and making sure you kind of think through that as well. So you can talk to your business owner and be like, hey, if we do this well, we could, improve X or Y, reduce costs here or something where it's like, it's very clear and you can very clearly tie it to the business. And so part of that communication is more like empathetically understanding what the business owner needs. And I think like, I think that's always like that, whatever, listening versus talking kind of concept, where it's like you have to just as much listen and understand someone else and understand what they want, and not just like kind of what you want to do. So I think that's kind of the aspect I usually try focusing on and gearing towards, as far as like, improving communication, especially from technical people. And again, I suffer from it just as much as I think any technical person does. Maybe not to the same degree. Some people I'm always impressed on their technical knowledge. And I'm just like, man, I don't have that. But then like you'll hear them try to communicate. And it's like, oh, but all you talk about is like, oh yeah, like we're using this many whatever CPU, like, and you're like, great. How does that help us? Like from the business side, because like what you realize that the business side, mostly what they care about is like the bottom line, right? Like it's like, okay, but how is this going to us improve, customer satisfaction or whatever? Because they're looking for the dollars and cents, and trying to tell that story from their perspective just as much as from ours.
Have you seen it, when you go into these companies, like the importance of the different roles? And I know somebody that I was talking to was telling me how they feel like they're a translator first. And it is exactly what you're saying. Like the business side wants to know one thing, but then the technical side wants to talk about another thing, and you need somebody in there to translate. But have you seen other roles that really help like the gel of the team?
Yeah, I think generally what companies will try to do is they'll have like either some sort of like business analyst, or some similar role where they're basically, they're maybe not technically as savvy as like an engineer would be. They're maybe SQL savvy, or they may be very analytically savvy, but they're also very savvy on the business side, and so they'll usually try to play that middle role. Of course, then you end up with other problems where it's like the business analyst wants some data, but the data engineers bogged down behind millions of other data requests, and then that's the whole other set of issues. But yeah, I think as far as roles go, I think that's generally why companies like to have like some sort of business analyst or someone that's like that middle ground between tech and business, because there's this weird gap. And it's funny because like I remember talking about it in college. Like they had like the two parabolas, right? Like they were like tech business. They're not like they don't think the same. They don't use the same vocabulary. You need someone kind of in that middle ground to branch it. And so yeah, it's a very common thing. It's interesting. It's weird how much it is that way. But yeah, so yeah, I think in general they'll have some sort of BA or something. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say I've seen the value of that directly. So I've done some contract work where adding a business analyst actually added a lot of value, because you had someone more senior in the company doing a lot of things, like having to keep up with the developers, all the other contract workers if they're like a really small company, and it's just a lot of inefficiencies. So sometimes it makes much more sense to have someone like just focus on that one role, and it does allow the opportunity to branch out into other things, right? Like you get a good amount of experience working with SQL, you're analyzing databases, doing all that. Eventually maybe pick up a new skill. Now you can model it now. I do think there's some benefits to like differentiate the roles, because it can be really difficult when everyone's kind of doing everything. And I've seen that, like the challenges of that in a small company, like a startup that's working with a lot of contractors is tough, Anyways, this has been so awesome. I feel like we wrote down a lot of good things. I've been taking notes as to some of the things you've been saying. But the last thing we want to close out with is this. So we like to leave away with some sort of like advice on what best practices you have learned, what things are helpful for you. But before we even get into that, one of the things I'm curious about, because you write about a lot of different topics, is what are your interests, and like what's something right now that you're really passionate about at the moment? Is it a technology, a new framework? Maybe you're looking at old stuff to refresh your memory. What's the thing that you're interested in right now?
Yeah. So I think as far as like, interests go. Sorry, I'm like suddenly just stopped thinking.
No, good. Data. So the cloud, you talk about the cloud, right? You have a lot of papers on infrastructure, ETL. I saw a lot of stuff on ETL, so I bet you have a lot of experience doing a bunch of that. So is it usually related to like your day-to-day work, or do you try to is there something that's new that you're learning at the moment?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both, right? Like, so I think as far as like what I like or what I'm interested in, I'm very much interested in trying to help a lot of, again, I think small companies get themselves to a point where they can take advantage of a lot of the stuff that exists that is now affordable. I think, it's like, before, having a full-time data scientist, having a full-time data engineer, managing, data warehouse or an ETL would be super expensive, right? Like, especially nowadays when, the average software engineer or data engineer costs somewhere in the range of 120 to 150K, a piece a year, and that's not even cost, putting in AWS charges and all of that, then suddenly, you're spending $300,000 on, just trying to answer some question that you don't know will bring you value or not. And so I think I've been very focused and very interested in like ways to help small companies like really approach these problems without having to take on that burden of cost. Whether it's using tools similar to like Fivetran or Stitch, because you can have this low code, no code ETL kind of approach, where you can take a lot of the advantages of having something that's like an ETL or ELT without having to do a lot of that heavy lifting of having to code every single connector. And so if you have questions, you can still answer them without having to hire a full-time data engineer. Maybe you just need to hire, again, someone like me or someone else, to consult and to bring in that data and to help you out just to answer those questions.
Hire Benjamin, guys. Everyone out there listening you gotta hire.
No. I mean that like regardless, like, it could be any like, I think I'm seeing definitely a lot more people looking into that consulting kind of like, especially in this space.
No, you're right. Yeah, it makes sense too for a lot of things, especially if you're just getting started and trying to like, I think some people, they rush into applying ML into maybe their app or their business, and it's like sometimes those two things don't mix easy. You have to do some basic things like, organize your data and have a good sense of what you're trying to do. But yeah, anyways, I just a thought on that.
No, I totally agree. So yeah, I think that's where I'm like really interested in. Like, you'll see even some of the topics I've been writing on recently have been like, how you can do stuff as a small business just to like start taking account of like what data you have, right? Like, because again, a lot of small businesses are using things like Salesforce or Asana or some tools that like they have data connectors, right? Like, these are things that like didn't exist 20 years ago or something similar, where it's like, yeah, you could connect to your like old ERP system, so it was really hard, right? Like, you wouldn't even want to if you were a small company, but now it's like super easy, and even more so again with these low code, no code kind of tools. You can do it technically, your business owner could do it. Should you? Probably not. I say it the same way as like, would you do your own accounting or your own legal work? Probably not. You probably should just hire. It just saves you time. Could you probably do it? Maybe. Yeah. It's not that you couldn't. It's just like,
Sure. I could also make my own clothes, I guess, but that might be really tricky to sit there and just like spit together.
Of clothes, did you guys check out this shirt yet? Look at this.
Oh
my!
he's digging
he's on it.
This. Yes, this is on fire, man. So I wanted to ask about when you go into a company and you're looking to start, before you even build anything out, I imagine you're trying to answer these key questions. Do you have a process about how you go about figuring out if even data science or ML is right for this company and how you can figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think there's like kind of like almost like a data maturity kind of like set of questions. Like, you ask again, like, what kind of data do you have? I think it's like question one, right? Like, do you even have data? Like, I think I once had someone be like, I have this list with emails on it, and like, okay, I can't do much. Like, what do you want me to do with that? Like, you don't even have dates when you got those emails, so I couldn't even tell you like if you're increasing or decreasing, some sort of weird time series model. Like, at least I could tell you like how many people come on average and how many you can expect in the future. But yeah, like just checking out like your data. It's like, kind of doing an inventory, kind of getting an idea of what the person even wants. Like, what is their end goal? I think that's always the big thing, is like trying to understand like what kind of initiative or project are they actually even trying to take on? Like, are they trying to reduce costs, increase whatever? Because if you don't understand that, like, that's what's going to drive whatever you're doing. So trying to understand their business goals, because again, like you said, you might not even need a fancy model. And like, if you understand their business goal, it's like, well, we could probably do that with some basic, either KPI or, some sort of basic analytics. I can answer that question. You don't need a fancy ML model. So I think trying to understand their goal and where they're at. So some other questions as far as kind of figuring that out, like goals, data sources. I have a process somewhere written out, but that's why I have it written out.
We'll have to link to that then, because that sounds really interesting. Do you have a blog specifically about that?
So yeah, I do, and I can send it to you guys later. So
nice, sweet, yeah.
So awesome. I have that process at least kind of written out, just to kind of like help guide people to be like, okay, like where are we? I think that's very important, just to understand where you are, as far as your kind of data analytics and data kind of strategy maturity in general. But yeah, so it's like also understanding what tools you have. Also understanding like what your team currently has as far as like skills, right? Like, because if your team can't maintain this thing, it doesn't matter, right? Like you also have to kind of gear your solutions towards the team, right? Like you're not going to build a Python solution for a team that's building in Java, or even more so, you're not going to build a Python solution for a team that's a bunch of analysts, right? Like it's like maybe, but can they support it, right? Like so you always have to think about like support. I think I see that a lot when like even with like data engineering, I'll see like analysts who want to build like data engineering pipelines, and then it's like, yeah, but then you have to maintain them. Like, so when it breaks, that means you need to come fix this. Like, and do you want to do that? Like, I think a lot of people don't understand that a lot of engineering is maintenance. Like things break, things need to migrate, things change, and that's what we spend 70% of our time doing. It's just like, oh, something broke, we better go fix it.
Pretty much.
This API just changed. We got to go, rechange the connections. Great, So, yeah.
So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Dimitrios. Anything else you wanted to add? I didn't want to cut off Dimitrios' thought.
I was just writing that down. I wanted to make that a little quote. 70% of engineering is maintenance. Things break.
All the time. The time. Awesome. All right. So the last thing. All right. This is what we like to do. We want to, if there's any nugget of wisdom, it could be something that's on your mind at the moment, something that like maybe something you were recently dealing with. What's like one nugget of wisdom that you would like to share with the community? Again, it could be something really small, something big, anything that you wish.
Shoot. I don't know.
What's like one challenge, like the most recent challenge? So it's probably around the data. Let's say something around the data. You mentioned earlier doing like, you mentioned so many good things. We're gonna have to link to a lot of this in the YouTube underneath the YouTube channel. But yeah, anything that's like relevant.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've recently kind of or it's been kind of my internal mantra more, because like I had a recent project that there was just a few hiccups, and it was, it was kind of tied to a combination of factors, and like, one of those factors being that like there was multiple kind of companies working together, trying to bring something about. And I think, the concept of like taking ownership regardless of who's responsible for what is really important. It's partly communication, but also partly like, you kind of need to be willing sometimes to be very direct with people. And I think, we can all work on that. And I think they were there, like looking back at that, like, again, it wasn't like the smoothest project that I think I've ever done. And, I think there were projects that have definitely been smoother. So it's like one of those things where it's like, well, what could have made it smoother? And like looking back, it's like, okay, if I had been more direct and taken more ownership of things, it would have made more sense. Like regardless of if it was mine or not, just taking ownership of the process. Like, I think that's one thing where it's like, sometimes the process itself doesn't have anyone, because there's like 3 or 4 people involved and 3 or 4 different companies. It's like, well, who should be in charge? It's like, someone needs to have like that ownership of that process, because otherwise you just eventually see things kind of crumble, because like no one's taking like having accountability for something. And so I think that was something that I recently picked up, where it's like, yeah, regardless of the situation, you kind of got to take like some ownership of something, so that things are smoothly going. Otherwise, if you're constantly waiting for someone else to do it, no one's going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable. The one thing that I thought was really like a practical like application of that is that you mentioned doing a write-up with after an analysis, like just share in summary in a concise way that someone non-technical can understand the value of this work. I think that there's some effort there in translating what you have done and communicate it in a way that makes sense to someone. But that also allows you to take more ownership of the process, right? Like, don't just expect things to automatically work and be reproducible and have all these great things. Like, you actually have to do that. And I think that you've laid out many concrete examples of what that looks like. So that's super valuable, guys. Anyone listening out there, I really appreciate that. That's something I'm definitely going to take to myself to be more direct, because a lot of times, like, it's just easier to kind of just like pass that responsibility to someone else, maybe someone on a different team, but it makes things more complicated in the end. So I think that's a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
Pass the buck.
Yeah.
That's what we got. Awesome, man. This has been so cool. I want to thank you, Benjamin, for coming on here, and Mr. Seattle data guy.
I love that name. That name is awesome. Yeah, I really like that name. By the way, how did you come up with that? Was that just like something you're like, I'm in Seattle, I like data,
Oh my
I
god.
think that's it, right? Like it's got that kind of ring to it, right? Like it's like the whole like whatever. I think you'll often see that in most like areas, right? Like they'll be like, oh, I'm the whatever, the lizard guy or something, and like that's the guy that you call for your child third birthday that brings lizards or something. It's like it's got that ring to it. I think people kind of get it.
I totally get it. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that was like yeah, it makes sense.
That
Slides
is
off the
amazing.
tongue. So,
Yeah,
funny.
it's a really cool way to remember it, and it makes it easy. Like if I'm on Medium and I'm like, who's that guy that I wanted to follow
The
or that I
Seattle
wanted to
data
read this
guy.
thing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he was a guy. He was in Seattle and he does
Yeah.
data. Oh yeah, that's right.
there
The
it is.
Seattle data. Yeah, I love
There's
that.
the guy.
Well, awesome, man. Well, we're gonna link to a lot of the resources that we've been mentioning and talking about, some really good
Basically
articles.
all of your blog articles.
Basically, and yeah, if there's anything, if you guys have any questions about some of the things we talked about, please reach out to me, Demetrius, or Benjamin himself. And we really appreciate the time that you made speaking with us, Benjamin. It was very
Benjamin,
helpful and
if
enjoyable.
anyone wants to get in touch, what's the best way to reach you?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you can ping me on LinkedIn for one. Benjamin Rogojan. That's another very unique thing. It's like if you Google me, I think I show up very quickly. Or you can go to the website and go to our contact page, so theseattledatiguy.com, and just reach out to us. Feel free to contact. I do check an email. I try to answer questions even if they're not necessarily about consulting. I'm trying to also, just be, help other people who are probably, starting their journey, whether it's in data science, whether it's in data engineering, whether it's in consulting. I try to be, pretty open as far as answering questions and how I can, give more information. Like sometimes that's like what you'll see as far as blog posts go. I think like one of the more popular ones was like a data science interview guide, where it was just like a Google sheet that I put together. It was like, hey, when I was interviewing, this is what I use. Like this is a great way of just tracking what you've already studied and what you should study and breaking it down. Because again, there's so much information out there. It's like just have a concise, clear way that you can track yourself so that you know what you've done and know what you haven't done.
Awesome. So cool. Well, thanks again. And to everyone out there, we will see you next time in our coffee session.
Yes.
Thank you both. Thank you, David. Thank you, Demetrios.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Appreciate it, guys.